On October 2, 1918, 500 men walked into a dense, fog-choked thicket of the Argonne Forest. 6 days later, the forest vomited back less than 200. The mystery of the lost battalion isn't just a story of a unit being surrounded, it is a forensic puzzle of how 500 lives were erased from the map while their own commanders, less than 2 miles away, argued over whether they even existed. Even as the men were being decimated by German machine guns, their most lethal threat wasn't the enemy in front of them, but the American artillery batteries behind them, which were systematically raining high-explosive shells onto the very ground they occupied. For 72 hours, the United States Army was effectively at war with itself, and the men in the Charlevaux Ravine were the only ones who knew it. The Argonne Forest in the autumn of 1918 was not a woodland, it was a topographical nightmare of ancient ravines, limestone ridges, and vegetation so thick that visibility was often reduced to less than 10 feet. This was the Hindenburg Line, the most sophisticated defensive network in human history. To the German army, it was a fortress. To the American 77th Division, it was a meat grinder. Major Charles Whittlesey, a gaunt, bespectacled New York lawyer who looked more like a librarian than a combat commander, was ordered to take his men in advance toward a specific objective, the Charlevaux Mill. His orders were absolute: under no circumstances will you retreat. It was a suicide pact signed in ink by generals who were looking at maps, not the terrain. As Whittlesey's men pushed forward, they did the impossible. They broke through the German lines, sliding through a narrow gap in the defenses and reaching the ravine below the mill. They dug in, expecting the units on their left and right, the French and the American 92nd, to be right behind them. But they weren't. The flanks had collapsed, pinned down by blistering fire. Unknowingly, Whittlesey had led his men into a pocket. By sunset, the gap behind them had closed. 554 men were now a solitary island in a sea of German gray. They were cut off from supplies, medical aid, and most importantly, information. The logistics of their isolation defy logic. The Germans didn't just surround them, they occupied the high ground on all 4 sides. The Americans were trapped at the bottom of a steep-sided bowl. Every move made by a soldier in that ravine was tracked by German snipers peering down from the ridges. There was no water except for a muddy stream at the bottom of the slope, but to reach it was to invite a bullet to the skull. Within 24 hours, the smell of rotting leaves was replaced by the copper tang of blood and the acrid stench of cordite. The information gap began to widen. At headquarters, the reports were contradictory. Some said Whittlesey had been wiped out. Others claimed he had retreated. No one believed he was actually on the objective. On the second day, the situation shifted from a tactical error to a logical anomaly. The American artillery, attempting to support the perceived front line, began a massive bombardment. But the coordinates were wrong. The shells didn't fall on the German ridges, they fell directly into the pocket. The men watched in horror as the giant whistling sounds of their own 155mm howitzers grew louder, the explosions walking up the ravine toward their shallow foxholes. This wasn't a few stray rounds. This was a sustained, calculated destruction of their position by their own brothers in arms. The men had no radio. Their only link to the world was a few crates of homing pigeons. The psychological weight of being hunted by your own side is a variable few historians can quantify. As the shells tore through the ancient oaks, showering the men with jagged iron and razor-sharp wooden splinters, the battalion's identity began to fracture. They were ghosts in the eyes of their command, yet very much alive and dying in the mud. Whittlesey scribbled a desperate note: "Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He attached the note to his last pigeon, a bird named Cher Ami. As the bird took flight, the men watched it as if it were their own souls leaving their bodies. The Germans saw it too. A hail of machine gun fire erupted. The bird was hit, spiraling toward the ground. In that moment, the 500 men in the ravine were effectively dead. They had no more birds, no more runners, and no more hope. But then, the anomaly occurred. The bird, despite losing an eye and a leg, took flight again. It was a biological miracle in a mechanical war. But while the bird flew, the men on the ground had to endure the silence that followed the barrage, a silence filled only by the clicks of German Mauser bolts. The Germans were baffled. They sent a messenger with a white flag, carrying a typed note. It wasn't a demand for surrender based on hate, but on logic. The note praised their bravery but pointed out the mathematical certainty of their destruction. It read, "The suffering of your wounded men can be heard over here in German lines, and we are appealing to your humane sentiments to stop." It would be quite useless to affirm any further. Whittlesey's response is the stuff of legend, but the reality is more chilling. He didn't shout a defiant slogan. He simply took the white sheets that were supposed to signal the location to planes and pulled them in. He chose to stay in the dark. He chose to remain lost. This decision transformed the battalion from a tactical unit into a psychological weapon. The Germans became convinced they were fighting a much larger force, a phantom army that refused to die even when their own artillery tried to kill them. This was the first logical pivot. The very incompetence of the American command had created a diversion so potent that it began to draw German reserves away from other critical sectors of the forest. By the fourth day, the physical reality of the men was deteriorating into something primitive. They were out of food. They were stripping the bandages off the dead to wrap the wounds of the living. The flavor of the Argonne had turned into a sensory overload of wet wool, gangrene, and cold, black mud. They were no longer soldiers, they were scavengers in a vertical graveyard. Every time a man tried to crawl toward a fallen comrade's haversack for a scrap of hardtack, a German sniper would put a bullet through the bag, spilling the contents into the dirt. It was a cruel, calculated game of cat and mouse. The mystery deepens when you examine the German records from those same days. The German commanders were reporting fierce counterattacks from the ravine, yet the Americans had no ammunition to launch attacks. What the Germans were hearing were the sounds of desperation, men screaming at the shadows, firing their last rounds at movement in the brush, and the terrifying, hollow echoes of the ravine amplifying every sound. To the Germans, the ravine was haunted. To the Americans, it was an altar of sacrifice. The disconnect between the two sides' perception of the battle highlights the cold truth. In the fog of war, the most dangerous enemy is the story being told by those who aren't there. As the fifth day dawned, a new variable entered the equation. The American command finally realized where the battalion was. Not because of the pigeon, but because of the sheer volume of German fire concentrated on a single coordinate. The logic was simple: if the Germans were firing everything they had at a void on the map, then that void must contain something valuable. The rescue attempt wasn't born out of a desire to save lives, but out of a realization that Whittlesey's men were inadvertently holding the key to the entire Argonne offensive. If they fell, the German line would solidify. If they held, the Hindenburg line would snap. The pressure inside the pocket reached a breaking point. The men were now using the bayonets of the dead as pitons to climb the muddy slopes, not to escape, but to find a better angle to die. The atmospheric tension was so thick it was almost tactile. The fog never lifted, it only changed colors, from a dull gray to a bruised purple as the sun set. And then, the ultimate sub-mystery began to surface. Among the survivors, stories began to circulate of a third party in the woods, shadowy figures that didn't wear the olive drab of the Americans or the field gray of the Germans. Were these deserters from both sides living in the limestone caves, or was the collective trauma of the battalion manifesting as a shared hallucination? As the sixth day arrived, the sounds of the forest changed. The rhythmic thump of German mortars was replaced by the chaotic, rolling thunder of an American breakthrough. The relief force was coming, but they weren't coming for the lost battalion. They were coming for the ridge. The men in the ravine watched as the forest above them erupted in flames. The delayed gratification of their survival was bittersweet. When the first soldiers of the 307th Infantry finally slid down the muddy embankments into the ravine, they didn't find a celebratory unit. They found a collection of living skeletons who looked at their rescuers with eyes that had seen the end of the world. Of the 554 men who entered the ravine, only 194 walked out. The rest were left in the soil of the Argonne. But the reveal, the synthesis of the mystery, wasn't found in the body count. It was found in the official inquiry that followed. The question wasn't just how did they survive, but why were they sent there in the first place? When the maps were laid out and the logs of the artillery batteries were synchronized with the movements of the battalion, a terrifying pattern emerged. The lost battalion had been a mistake of geometry, a failure of the military's ability to perceive reality over the idealized lines on a map. They were never lost to the enemy, they were lost to the system that created them. When the relief columns finally breached the German perimeter, the scene they encountered was not one of military triumph, but a tableau of biological and psychological collapse. The air in the Charlevaux Ravine had fermented. It was a stagnant mixture of decomposing flesh, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, alkaline smell of the limestone that had been pulverized by 5 days of continuous shelling. The survivors didn't cheer. They didn't move. They sat in their shallow pits, staring at the newcomers with eyes that had retreated deep into their sockets, a condition later classified as the 1,000-yard stare, but which, in 1918, was simply seen as a soul that had already left the body. This is where the forensic investigation into the lost battalion begins, not with the rescue, but with the wreckage left behind. The physical toll on the men was a data set of extreme endurance. Post-rescue medical reports detailed cases of trench foot so advanced that skin would slough off with the removal of a sock, revealing the white, necrotic bone beneath. Men had lived on a caloric intake of 0 for nearly 96 hours, their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue to maintain core temperature in the freezing October rain. But the most disturbing evidence was the friendly fire trauma. Surgeons found that a significant percentage of the shrapnel removed from the survivors' backs was American-made. The 155mm shells that had rained down on them on the second and third days had left a permanent, jagged signature in the flesh of the very men they were intended to protect. The logistical information gap that had led to this catastrophe was not a simple mistake, it was a systemic failure of communication. The investigation revealed that the 77th Division's headquarters had been operating on a delay of nearly 12 hours. While Whittlesey was sending runners back into the woods, men who were systematically hunted and killed by German patrols, the generals were moving pins on a map that represented units that no longer existed in those locations. The cold truth is that the lost battalion was a casualty of the transition between 19th century tactics and 20th century technology. They were using pigeons to communicate in an age of machine guns. As the survivors were filtered back into the rear lines, a new mystery began to emerge, the psychological disintegration of Major Charles Whittlesey. To the public, he was a hero. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was the man who had looked at the German surrender demand and told them to go to hell. But the analytical reality was far more somber. Whittlesey, the meticulous lawyer, began to obsess over the names of the men he had lost. He kept lists. He kept letters. He began to see himself not as a savior, but as a ledger keeper of the dead. He was haunted by the why had his orders been so rigid? Why had the artillery not listened? Why was he the one who walked out while 500 others were erased? The forensic aftermath moved from the forest to the halls of power. In the months following the armistice, the U.S. military conducted a quiet inquiry into the Charlevaux incident. They were looking for a scapegoat for the friendly fire barrage. But as they dug into the logs of the 305th Field Artillery, they found a chilling lack of accountability. The coordinates had been verified. The orders had been signed. The system had functioned perfectly on paper, yet it had produced a massacre. The battalion was lost because the military's internal logic could not account for a unit that actually succeeded in its mission. Because Whittlesey had done exactly what he was told, taking the objective against all odds, he had effectively moved off the known map. The logical pivot of the story shifts here, from the war in the forest to the war in the mind. By 1921, the United States was preparing to bury the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. Charles Whittlesey was chosen as a pallbearer. He stood alongside other heroes of the Great War, but witnesses noted that he looked more like a ghost than the men he was carrying. He was thin, his hair had turned silver, and he seemed to be vibrating with a suppressed tension. The ceremony, intended to provide closure for a nation, provided only a deeper information gap for Whittlesey. To him, the unknown soldier wasn't a symbol, it was one of his men. It was a face he couldn't name from the ravine. 3 weeks after the ceremony, on November 26, 1921, the final reveal of the lost battalion's legacy occurred. Whittlesey boarded the SS Toloa, a steamship bound for Havana. He was seen on deck, impeccably dressed, dining with the captain, and discussing the legalities of the fruit trade. He was, to all outward appearances, a man who had moved on. He sat in the smoking room until 11:15 p.m., talking quietly about the weather. He then excused himself, saying he was going to his stateroom to sleep. He left behind a series of envelopes in his cabin, letters addressed to his parents, his brothers, and his friends. He even left a note for the captain with instructions on how to handle his luggage. When the ship docked in Havana, Charles Whittlesey was gone. There was no struggle. No splash was heard. No body was ever recovered from the dark Atlantic waters. The man who had survived the most concentrated slaughter of the First World War had walked to the rail of a luxury liner and stepped into the void. The delayed gratification of his survival had reached its expiration date. The logic of his disappearance was the same logic of the ravine: when you are surrounded by a force you cannot defeat, whether it is an army or a memory, the only tactical move left is to vanish. The synthesis of the mystery lies in the fact that the lost battalion never truly returned from the Argonne. While the physical men were extracted, the identity of the unit was shattered by the realization that they were expendable. The records of the 77th Division show that in the years following the war, an abnormally high percentage of the survivors suffered from nervous breakdowns, alcoholism, and early death. The atmospheric dread of the forest had followed them home. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a state of being where the rules of the world no longer applied, where your friends were your killers, and where a bird was your only hope. In the final analysis, the story of the 500 men who vanished into the Argonne is a warning about the fallibility of systems. We rely on maps, on coordinates, and on the chain of command to provide order to the chaos of existence. But the Charlevaux Ravine proves that those systems are fragile. The men were lost not because they lacked a compass, but because the people holding the maps refused to believe where the compass was pointing. The 194 men who walked out were merely the physical residue of a larger tragedy, a tragedy of data being prioritized over human life. Whittlesey's final letters were never made public in their entirety, but those who saw them described them as unbearably logical. He wasn't a man in the throes of a passionate breakdown, he was a man who had completed a balance sheet and found that the numbers didn't add up. He had spent 3 years trying to reconcile the heroism he was credited with the horror he had witnessed. In the end, the math was too heavy. He chose the ocean because, unlike the ravine, the ocean doesn't leave a trail. It doesn't require a map. It only requires a silence that the world can never break. The legacy of the lost battalion remains etched in the topography of the Argonne. Even today, hikers in the Charlevaux Ravine find rusted helmets, fragments of American mess kits, and the occasional brass casing of a 155mm shell. These are the macro clues of a mystery that has no satisfying resolution. The ground still holds the iron that the men could not escape. And as the fog rolls in through the trees, changing from gray to purple as the sun sets, it is easy to understand why the Germans thought the place was haunted. It is haunted, not by ghosts, but by the unanswered questions of 500 men who were told to hold their ground, and then were forgotten by the very ground they held. The cold truth is that we are all, in some way, part of a lost battalion, moving through a forest we don't understand, following orders from people we will never meet, and hoping that the shells falling around us are coming from the enemy, and not from our own side. The mystery isn't that they vanished, the mystery is that any of them ever expected to come back.